I know the one thing we did right was the day we started to fight. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on.
Kanye. What is this nigga thinking? What is this nigga thinking? Seriously, Kanye? Slavery sounds like a choice to you? I mean, first of all, I don't mess with Donald Trump, okay? And you know what verb I really mean to use in the place of mess, but I can't say that. But at the same time, it's not as if I think that absolutely every person out there who supports Donald Trump or is sympathetic to him in some way is necessarily just a raging bigot or an Uncle Tom in the case of a black person like Kanye West or anything like that. It's not that simple. I'm a big fan of nuance and of just generally trying to understand where people are coming from and not reflexively demonizing people simply because they disagree with me. If that were the case, I would be demonized all the time. I myself am a black person who is not on the political left, who considers himself a libertarian, albeit a moderate, pragmatic, realistic one.
A lot of folks who run and work for private charities and nonprofits themselves believe that the government should do more to help the poor rather than less. Why do you think that is if they do such a better job than the government does?
And who all too often comes in for a lot of opprobrium from people who think that the only acceptable political worldview for a black person to have is some species of leftist political thought. I don't buy into that viewpoint. And even in the days when I was a teenager who considered himself a leftist, even back then, I didn't automatically leap to disdain or scorn any and all black folks who are not on the left as Uncle Toms or coons in the preferred terminology of today. So when Kanye says things like black folks don't all have to be Democrats, or when he talks about black folks not being so quick to blame racism for all our problems and messages along those general lines, I can actually sympathize to some degree. Some degree, mind you. The problem is, I think Kanye's stated rationales for supporting Trump, such as they are not intellectually respectable or worth taking seriously at all. This remark he's made about slavery is just the last straw. Now, I stopped taking Kanye seriously, at least in his spoken statements, as opposed to his song lyrics, a long time ago. I've always been of the opinion that Kanye is much better when he's rapping than when he's speaking, because it's when he speaks off the cuff outside of his song lyrics that he really tends to make an ass of himself and to show his ass, quite frankly. But at the same time, there have been times when he said some things that made sense in the past. I mean, again, particularly in his song lyrics. The system broken, the schools closed, the prisons open. Whatever happened to that Kanye? Less than a decade ago, he was identifying systematic injustice and institutionalized racism in American society, which I do agree exists and is still a problem that still holds black people back to this very day. I mean, the evidence is there. The data is there. Just a couple years ago, I think, he was complaining about how people in industries like the fashion industry and the tech industry weren't taking him seriously despite his efforts to break into those sectors of the economy, simply because he was black and because he was a rapper. I remember him tweeting at one point, "The system is set up for us to fail." Us clearly referring to black people in general. When acquaintances of mine spoke out in his defense, I often was the one who said, well, you know, not everything that Kanye is saying is making sense. For example, I thought it was absurd for him to blame racism for the difficulties he encountered in trying to break into the fashion and technology sectors. Kanye has spent his whole career so far giving people of all races perfectly good reasons not to want to work with him. Reasons that had nothing to do with his skin color. While I agree that racial discrimination probably does occur in those industries, I don't think Kanye West was ever a good poster child for that cause. Even so, though, what in creation made him go from that to this? And now he's messing with slavery, trivializing slavery, or drawing facile analogies between slavery and other things that are really nowhere near as bad as slavery, like taxation or military conscription, for example. That's a great way to get on my nerves.
Sorry to cut you off, but personally, I've never been a fan of slavery analogies, to be honest. I'm not gonna lie. I say that probably as a descendant of actual slaves.
I don't know what it is about slavery that makes so many people so willing to just brush it off or sweep it under a rug or act like it was a matter of choice. I mean, really. If Kanye had said, you know, I think there should be more room in the public square for black folks to express support for the ideas of limited government and individual liberty, then that would have been fine. But as it turned out, the things he said were incoherent and nonsensical, as well as misinformed on a factual level.
I appreciate when people evolve in their politics. If he has come to a place where he, I don't know, believes in small government and strong national defense and individualism, that's fine. I'm a political analyst, and I did not understand what he was saying. The Republican platforms that I love and believe in with all my heart have absolutely nothing to do with anything you're saying whatsoever.
So that's my big beef with Kanye here. I mean, slavery was a choice. Because it lasted for 400 years, that means that black people somehow gave into it or caved into it too easily.
When you hear about slavery for 400 years, for 400 years, that sounds like a choice. You was there for 400 years and it's all of y'all? It's like we're mentally in prison.
This just shows how shallow Kanye's historical understanding is. Kanye West doesn't seem to be aware of just how slavery played out, especially in the early stages of the transatlantic slave trade. The way it played out is that European slave traders, I think the Portuguese were the first ones to get in on the game in a big way. They would stay mostly on the West African coast at slave trading outposts. West African tribes and kingdoms that were warring with each other would bring their prisoners of war to the coast to sell them in exchange for guns and other resources that were scarce in their jurisdictions. But the problem is the slaves that were taken across the Atlantic on those slave ships, they came from a variety of different backgrounds. They often didn't speak the same languages. They often didn't worship the same gods or practice the same religions in general. They sometimes came from nations and tribes that were warring with each other. They didn't have a unified identity at the time. This whole Afro-diasporic identity, or identities rather, all those identities that have taken shape in the past few hundred years took shape because of the slave trade and the decades and centuries of institutional oppression that followed it. This was an exercise in nation formation because I do believe that the African diaspora and the branches within it constitute nations unto themselves in their own right, in the sociological sense of the word. Not countries, but societies with a common culture, heritage, history, traditions, customs, etc. A common shared identity. But that happened because black Africans from a wide variety of different backgrounds were thrown together in the slave ships and on the plantations, in the mines where they were subjected to back-breaking manual labor in a way that made it difficult for them to unify and build a coherent community and culture and power base for the future. Never mind that in addition to that, the practice of selling slaves away from their biological family members also weakened the black family structure. In addition to that, slaveholding territories throughout the whole Western Hemisphere built up a whole elaborate system of laws and other policies, as well as social customs and practices to keep slavery in place. That's why it lasted as long as it did. It's not as if the slaves themselves didn't want to be free or didn't try to be free wherever possible, but they had all these obstacles to contend with. There were security systems set up on these plantations, overseers. There were Southerners and others who devoted their entire lives and careers to hunting down runaway slaves, capturing them, and returning them to their former enslavers. Professional slave catchers. You had the Fugitive Slave Clause of the U.S. Constitution. You had the Fugitive Slave Act that was passed in the mid-19th century. You had provisions of the Constitution like the 3/5 Clause, which, although it didn't actually define a black person as 3/5 of a human being, which is a narrative that you often hear, which is actually a misconception, factually. Nonetheless, it did artificially inflate the populations of the southern states for the purpose of apportioning congressional seats. So those states got more seats and therefore more votes and more clout at the federal level within Congress than they really deserved to have, given that they didn't treat their slaves as people, they treated them as property. That helped give the southern states a lot of clout at the federal level that enabled them to prevent any reforms that would endanger the institution of slavery. These are just a few examples that I can name off the top of my head. So when Kanye says that slavery was a choice, the fact that it lasted so long sounds like a choice. He just doesn't know what the hell he's talking about.
When he goes on, TMZ and he says slavery was a choice, even though I think that's a stupid statement. And, I told him miscommunication is his biggest problem. I know that he was talking about psychological slavery, but it's not about what you meant to say. It's about what you actually said. And what he actually said on TMZ was stupid.
And it's really irritating to hear someone in his position spout such nonsense. And I'm glad that that other gentleman from TMZ called him out on it.
Dude, do you feel that I'm being free and I'm thinking free? I actually don't think you're thinking anything. I think what you're doing right now is actually the absence of thought. And the reason why I feel like that is because, Kanye, you're entitled to your opinion. You're entitled to believe whatever you want. But there is fact and real world, real life consequence behind everything that you just said. And while you are making music and being an artist and living the life that you've earned by being a genius, the rest of us in society have to deal with these threats to our lives. We have to deal with the marginalization that has come from the 400 years of slavery that you said for our people was a choice. Frankly, I'm disappointed, I'm appalled, and brother, I am unbelievably hurt by the fact that you have morphed into something, to me, that's not real.
Then again, has Kanye West ever really been a particularly rigorous intellectual thinker? Not really. It's not that he's totally brainwashed necessarily, but he's only looking at certain voices who cherry-pick facts and data and only give him part of the story, not the whole big picture. That's why I call myself a realistic, moderate, pragmatic libertarian. That's why I go out of my way not only to read libertarian sources of commentary and news, but also liberal and conservative sources of commentary. Because I don't pretend that only people who share my worldview know what time it is. I don't pretend that people who share my political worldview or outlook have a monopoly on the truth. I understand that the world is a much more complicated and messy place than that, and no one ideology has all the answers. Even if I were a socialist or a liberal or a conservative, I would take the same pragmatic, moderate, realistic approach to those ideologies as well. And so should you, and so should Kanye, and Candace Owens, and all the rest of them. So Kanye is badly in need of a reality check. Like my favorite YouTuber Lovely T said in her response to this nonsense, what are the odds that Kanye would have trivialized the genocide that afflicted his wife's people, the Armenian genocide from just over a century ago? Would Kanye have dared try to minimize or trivialize that? Would he have dared to try to trivialize the Holocaust? Maybe, but I suspect not. So it is distressing to me to see a prominent black individual denigrate his own people's suffering in this manner and refuse to acknowledge the present-day injustices and disadvantages that they face, even though he himself has acknowledged them explicitly in the past, and the not-too-distant past at that, and even worked them into his song lyrics. So Kanye, you really do need a reality check. I just hope you get it. Fast.